Hi everyone, my name's Jordan and welcome back to my channel. Today I am filming my January wrap-up. January was an incredibly good month for me. I read so many more books than I had planned, and I really read some absolute bangers. So I am so excited to talk to you guys about what I got through in January. So without further ado, let's get into it. First, literally on January 1st, I read the last 4 volumes of Naruto. I have been on this Naruto journey for probably 2 years or so. There's 72 volumes, so I read 69 through 72, and I absolutely loved them. I mean, obviously I went through 4 volumes in one day because those last probably 6 or 7 volumes were so good, so emotional, and they wrapped up in such a satisfying way. So I really loved this whole series. I'm going to be doing a full kind of review discussion of my entire experience of reading all 72 volumes. So I'll get more into my details on how I feel about this series then, but overall I really loved it. There was a few pacing issues throughout, but in the 4 I read in January, there was none of that. It was all beautiful, and there were so many emotional conclusions to different plot lines and stuff that were just so satisfying. So I really enjoyed the end of this series. Next up, I read City of Dragons by Robin Hobb. This is the 3rd book in the Rainwild Chronicles, which is the 4th series in the realm of the Elderlings. And this series as a whole is kind of always talked about as the least good of all 5 of the series, but at the end of the day, it's still a Robin Hobb series. I agree that this is not as impactful and as intriguing as some of her other series in this overall realm of the Elderlings, but I still think that this series is good as a whole. There were a few points in this one where I felt like it dragged a little bit, but overall, I think it was still a good continuation of the series. There are 4 total books in this series, and I will get to Blood of Dragons in this same video because I also read it in January. But overall, this one was pretty good, but it had a few pacing issues. But overall, I really enjoyed the characters, and I liked some of the places the plot went in this one. Next up, I read Ocean's Echo by Everina Maxwell. This is the same author that wrote Winter's Orbit, and Ocean's Echo for me was kind of a letdown because while it was not a bad book, it really felt like almost like copy and paste of the plot from Winter's Orbit to this one, just with different circumstances. But it was about a political marriage of convenience, and a lot of it felt just very similar, and overall it made it kind of boring because I've read it before. So while I loved Winter's Orbit, I loved where that book went and what it talked about and all of that, I feel like this one, since it felt so similar to Winter's Orbit, it was kind of a letdown because I wanted something new from her. Next up, I read A Game of Thrones by George R.R. Martin. This is part of the huge read-along being hosted by Joanna and a few other booktubers, and I had a pretty good time with it. I've read all of Game of Thrones except I DNF'd the 5th one a few years ago. It was probably 3 or 4 years ago, and I think I was not ready for that series at that time because I was mostly reading YA fantasy, and I just wanted to read Game of Thrones because the show was really big. And so I read it, and I think I just wasn't ready for that dark and political of a fantasy story because I was mostly reading fantasy romance kind of things. So this time around, I was able to appreciate more the prose and how well thought out the plot and the political machinations and things were. However, I don't know if I enjoyed it more than last time, because last time I did enjoy it. I enjoyed reading this book. I read it pretty quick, especially for how big these books are. So I did enjoy it, but I don't know if I enjoyed it more than last time, but I definitely respected it more this time around. And I'm hoping that as I continue with the series, I start to like them more. I'm mostly done with Clash of Kings. I have a little bit longer left in it, and I am enjoying it. Although the first half there was some pacing issues, but I'll get more into that in my February wrap-up. But overall, Game of Thrones was enjoyable. I gave it 4 stars. I don't think it's going to be one of my favorite fantasy series of all time, but it isn't bad by any means. I definitely get the hype and I get why everyone loves it, and they are excellently crafted books. Next up, I read The New Age of Empire by Kahindi Andrews. This is a nonfiction book that is about imperialism and its effects on the globe today. and it gets really into a lot of nuances of things that I haven't, I've read a lot of books along this kind of vein, but I really got into some things that I have never read about before, which is really interesting because a lot of the nonfiction I read are based in like American political atmospheres, and this was kind of a global view on all of it, and it was very interesting to read. It was kind of eye-opening. I read this because I saw that Monet over on Life as Monet had it as one of her favorite books of 2022, so I decided to pick it up, and it was phenomenal. I think a lot of it was very harrowing, and because this is not just based on American imperialism, I think it could be a great read for anyone. So even if you are not based in America, I think this could be a great read for anyone because it talks a lot about European and American imperialism and its effects on like the global South. So I highly recommend this book. Next up was a reread for me, and that is The Justice of Kings by Richard Swan. This is the first book in the Empire of the Wolf series, and Tyranny of Faith is coming out in February, so I wanted to reread this because I haven't read it since before it came out because I had an arc. So I wanted to give this a reread before going into Tyranny of Faith so that I was fully up to date, and man, this book is just phenomenal. It's just as good as I remember. The longer I sat with this book, the more I liked it, and so I was nervous that I wouldn't like it as much on a reread, but I liked it just as much, if not more. This book is about a justice for this empire that goes around, and he has these magical powers that help him like make people answer his questions about crimes and stuff, and he goes town to town and deals out justice. And it's supposed to be this non-biased way of doing justice. And him and his two retainers end up in this small town where there is like a murder that has taken place, and there's this full murder mystery that goes on, and it's just a wonderfully crafted book with a really interesting magic system. I had honestly forgotten how dark it gets by the end. Like the end, it gets really dark. It's like towing the boundary of grimdark, but in like the best way. It was so good. The characters are really interesting. The whole thing is told from one of the retainers' point of views. Helena, she is like his clerk almost, and so it's all told from her point of view, so you kind of get to see the character growth that Sir Conrad, the justice, goes through from beginning to end, but also what Helena goes through from beginning to end. And it's just a really beautiful story. It's a really beautiful discussion on relationships and like power and things like that. It is a phenomenal book, and I am so excited about Tyranny of Faith coming out. I will get to that later because I also read it this month because I have an arc, but I'm so excited for it to come out so everyone can read it because it is phenomenal. Next up, I read Gardens of the Moon by Steven Erikson. This is a read-along that I am co-hosting with Alex from Tall Guy Reads, Josh from Red Fury Books, and Ian from Ian the Reader. This is the first book in the Malazan Book of the Fallen, and it is like a very famous fantasy series that a lot of people, including me, are intimidated by, and it is like this very political story with a really interesting magic system. I won't get too far into what the plot is about just because it is so unique, but it's also hard to explain. But overall, I absolutely loved this book. It was like I liked it much more than I thought I would just because I've heard so much about how confusing it is and how hard it can be to follow the plot and the characters because you are kind of just dropped in this world, and not much is like just explicitly explained to the reader. A lot of it is just kind of you picking up context clues and deducing what you think those mean along the way. But I really enjoyed that. I was just kind of along for the ride. I didn't try to overanalyze anything or try to figure out what was going on at any point. I just kind of let the story take me where it would, and I really loved it. And I'm so excited to read Dead House Gates. I'm going to read it probably towards the end of February. If you want more information about this read-along as a whole, I will link our kickoff video down below. We are also going to be doing a full spoilery discussion on Gardens of the Moon on February 20th. So look out for that. And that means you have time to read this if you still haven't gotten to it. We aren't doing the live discussion until February 20th. So you've got some time to read this if you want to join the read along. It was a phenomenal book, and I think it was a great introduction. And I think it was not nearly as confusing as people made it out to be. As long as you go into it knowing that you're not going to have all of the answers every step of the way, and you just go with the flow, I think you will really like this book. The magic was just that was my favorite part. The magic was so dope. Next up, I read Nemesis Games by James S.A. Corey. This is the 5th book in the Expanse series, which is a huge series. It starts with Leviathan Wakes. That is a very political heavy sci-fi story. I am really enjoying this series. It has just gotten better as I've gone along. The first two I was a little uncertain on. I wasn't loving them, but I wasn't hating them. But then the third, the fourth, and the fifth have just been getting better and better, and I'm falling in love with these characters. I think there's 9 total books, so I think I only have 4 more main novels to go. So I'm very excited for where this story is going to take me. It is a very politics heavy, more like realistic science fiction story. A lot of it is like, there's the Earthers, there's the Martians, there's the Belters, and like there's all of that. So it's very politics heavy, but then there is also kind of like an alien organism that comes into play. So there is like some stuff that is not all politics, but a lot of those situations become very political. So it does feel very more like realistic than like cool science fiction kind of thing. But in the best of ways, I think it's handled very well and done really well. And I'm really, really loving this series. I'm hoping to finish it in the next few months because I've been listening to the audiobooks, which, as you guys know, I can read audiobooks a little faster than physical books because I listen to audiobooks while I'm at work. So it's like at least 5 hours a day nonstop of me listening to audiobooks, so I'm able to just get more reading done when I'm doing audiobooks. So I'm hoping to finish this series in the next few months because I am absolutely loving them, and the audiobooks are also very good. Next up, I read The Daughters of Illdah by Hadir Elsbai. This is the first book in a duology, and I liked it, but I think it was not very unique, I guess. I feel like I've read something like it before. It is a magical story that is like a feminist fantasy series. I read it towards the middle of January, and right now it's the beginning of February, and I honestly don't remember a whole lot about what it's about. It didn't really stick with me very much. I don't think it was a bad book by any means. It was well written, the magic was interesting, the characters were interesting, there was like a political revolution going on. I just didn't find it very unique, therefore it didn't really stick with me, and I honestly can't really tell you much more about the plot because I don't remember. But overall, again, not a bad book by any means. It just didn't really hit for me as well as it has for some other people I've seen that read it. Next up, I read The Righteous Mind by Jonathan Haidt. This is one of the 12 books chosen for me by 12 booktubers, and this one was chosen for me by Kyle over on Read by Kyle. And this is a nonfiction book that kind of goes into the psychology of why our minds are so divided on politics, which is right up Kyle's alley. It totally makes sense why this is one of his favorite books. And Kyle knows I also really enjoy nonfiction books about politics, and so I went into this with a pretty open mind, and I think it was good. I think that a lot of it was kind of dry for me just because I'm not as interested in psychology itself. Like, I'm not as interested in the psychology of our brains and things like that. So that's not a knock on the book because that's just my personal preference. I did think that some of the views that Jonathan Haidt kind of put out there and asserted throughout the book, some of them felt a little naive almost, with kind of the like, we have to put our differences aside and band together kind of thing, which I think is a good idea to have, but I think can sometimes come off as a little naive just because like how possible is it? But at the end of the day, I think he did a really good job of talking about how our brains work and that is why we should come together, which I think is a really interesting and good thing to think. So at the end of the day, it was a good book. I think he did a great job of putting forth his ideas. I just didn't really resonate as much with the science of it because it's just not something I'm super interested in. And again, that's not a knock on the book. That's just kind of my taste. Next up, I read the first volume of Pretty Guardian Sailor Moon Eternal, the longest title in existence. This is the 10-volume manga series that kind of encapsulates Sailor Moon. One of my best friends is a huge fan of Sailor Moon, but I've never watched the TV show or read any of the mangas, and so I decided to give it a try, and I really loved the first volume. I thought it was so fun, and I think the characters are really great, and the magic is cool, and how it like is based on the planets and the moon and things like that. I think the whole like celestial aspect of it was really fun. So I think that this book was a lot of fun. I had a great time reading it, and the art is really interesting. It's really pretty. It's definitely geared towards like a younger audience. The characters are like 16 and they're very young and like naive and things like that. So it definitely is geared towards a younger audience, but I still had such a good time reading it. Next up, I read Tress of the Emerald Sea by Brandon Sanderson. This is the first book in the year of Sanderson, and I had no idea that I was going to be getting the ebook of it on January 1st. I backed the Kickstarter at the hardcover level, so I thought that I was just going to have to read it once I got the hardcover, but lo and behold, I woke up on January 1st with the ebook in my email. So I was so ecstatic about that, and I read it as soon as I could, and it was absolutely phenomenal. I loved it so much. It honestly felt like the book was written just for me. I have a full dedicated review that I will link below if you're interested in seeing my more detailed thoughts. But overall, this was kind of Brandon Sanderson's take on a fairy tale, and it follows this girl Tress, who is on this planet where there are these spores that create the oceans. And activating the different color spores does different things, and she's kind of like an engineer who has to go save this prince that she's in love with from like the evil queen or whatever, and she engineers these like tools that help her use the spores in all these really creative ways, and she kind of gets this found family, and it's just a really, really beautiful like fairy tale story of Brandon Sanderson's, and this is probably in my top 3 favorite Sanderson books, and I know that's saying a lot, but this book felt like it checked every box of what I like in books. So this story was absolutely phenomenal, and I loved this book so much. Next up, as I mentioned earlier in the video, I read Blood of Dragons by Robin Hobb. This is the final book in the Rainwild Chronicles, and I thought this was a good conclusion. My overall thoughts of the series is I think that this could have been a duology. I think it was just too long. There was a lot of travel in these books. There was a lot of just them getting from point A to point B. So I think that a lot of it could have been trimmed down a little bit, but overall, I still really enjoyed the characters. I especially enjoyed the lore that we got. We got so much more deep into the lore of the world and how the dragons work and the elderlings and what the elderlings even were, and it was just a really, really interesting series as a whole. I just think it was a little too long. So overall, all 4 books were good. Some were better than others. I think the story itself was very good. I just think it was too long. Next up, I read Hellbent by Leigh Bardugo. This is the second book in the Alex Stern series after Ninth House, and this is something that Leigh Bardugo fans have been waiting for such a long time, and I am so excited it finally came out. I listened to it on audio, and it was so good. This series is so dark, and it goes into some really interesting places, but Leigh Bardugo does such a good job of showing grief and resilience and kind of like what trauma does to your character, and I think that this book was such a good second book. We got a lot more of the lore, we got a lot more magic than the first book, and I think that it answered a lot of questions while still leaving a lot of open doors for the third book, and this book was just so good. I can't wait to reread it because I'm sure there's things I missed the first time through. So overall, really excited for the third book now. I hope we don't have to wait like 3 years like last time, but this book was so good. It's about a woman named Alex Stern who comes from a really rough background. There's a lot of trigger warnings, so check that out. She can see ghosts, which are called greys in this world, and no one else around her can. But there are these secret societies at Yale that do these rituals that interact with ghosts for whatever ends they're trying to get. But everyone else has to take a potion that allows them to see these ghosts, and the potion is very dangerous. So the fact that Alex can see the ghosts without taking this potion is incredible. So Yale recruits her to join these secret societies, and she doesn't really fit in because she comes from a rougher background, but she quickly gets wrapped up in a lot of the drama that's going on at the school, and it's a very dark story. There's like demons, and there's the hell realm, hellbent. Like there is a lot of lore that goes into it that's more than just like ghosts. Like it's not just everyone can see ghosts, but it's such a phenomenal story, so I highly recommend this series. Next up, I read Tyranny of Faith by Richard Swan, which is, like I said earlier, the sequel to Justice of Kings. This is an arc. The book comes out, I believe, on Valentine's Day, and I absolutely loved this second book. It expands the world a lot. It gets even darker. There's a lot of political machinations and stuff now that the whole crew is back in the capital of this empire, and there's a lot of discussions on imperialism, and is imperialism better for the small folk or is it not? And I think it's incredible where this book goes. I won't get too far into it because the book's not even out yet, and it's the sequel, but I highly, highly recommend you read this series. Next up, I read Every Heart of Norway by Shauna Maguire. This is the first book in the Wayward Children series. It's like a series of novellas, and I really liked it. It was my second time reading a Seanan McGuire book, and I think that while it has a lot of similar themes, it was still unique enough that it was entertaining on its own. And I really, really liked it. It's about these children that find doorways to these other worlds, and then they come back to their world, and this woman kind of takes them all in and schools them, because all they all want to do for the most part is go back to these worlds that they've been to, only they have to find another doorway, and they aren't fitting in regular society anymore. So it was just a really interesting book about like the outcasts of society, and there's like a lot of interesting magical ties in it, and overall it was just a really great book. There's like a murder mystery going on throughout, and I really liked it. I think Seanan McGuire does such a good job of writing children and younger kids while also still having adult themes, and overall it was just a really, really fun book. Next up, I read The Institute by Stephen King, and I've never read this book before, and it was really good. I've heard some people not like it, but I thought it was really interesting. It definitely has like some Stranger Things vibes. It's about these kids that are telepathic and or telekinetic. They get basically kidnapped and brought to this institute where a lot of like scientific tests are done on them to try to like do things for the government. It's like a secret governmental facility, and it's really dark and it's really scary, and ultimately was so good. I really enjoyed it. I listened to it so fast because I was so enthralled by the story, and I don't really get a lot of the hate for it because I thought it was really good. But I know that it's not everyone's favorite. I had a blast, so I think it was a really good book and really dark. Next up, I read Our Wives Under the Sea by Julia Armfield. This is kind of like, I don't know how to describe it. It's kind of like a thriller sci-fi, but also really slow romance book. It's hard to describe, but it's basically about this woman who goes on this deep sea adventure. She's like a marine biologist or whatever, and she's gone for months, and no one knows what happens to this expedition. And her wife is back home thinking that she's dead, and then she comes back, but she's changed. She is different than when she left, and it's like a really sad story. You get a lot of flashbacks, and it's just a really beautiful, touching, sad story. I cried at the end. It's definitely very slow paced, so I think that a lot of people don't like it because of that, but I think the slow pacing was really beautiful, the way it was written. Although, to be fair, I did listen to the audiobook. The audiobook's only 5 hours, and I typically listen to audiobooks at about 3 times speed, if not a little bit slower. So I was able to listen to it in just under 2 hours. So I can definitely see how the pacing being slow would be harder if you were reading it physically. But listening to the audiobook, I didn't have a pacing issue, and I thought that it was a beautiful, beautiful story. And then I had 2 DNFs that I will just talk about briefly. One was The Fifth Horseman by John Smith, which was supposed to be like a comedy fantasy about like death and the Grim Reaper and stuff. And it was just boring, and it felt very amateurly written, so I DNF'd it. And then I DNF'd The Heroes by Joe Abercrombie, which is the second standalone after the original First Law trilogy. I just thought it was boring, honestly. I think Joe Abercrombie's writing is great. I think that he's funny. I think that his characters are good. I was just so bored with this one. And so I DNF'd it. I'm going to skip Red Country, I think. And I think I'm going to try Age of Madness and see if it works better for me, because I have a full dedicated review for the original First Law trilogy down below that you can check out. Well, that series just didn't really work for me. I think it was really well written, and I respect it, and I enjoyed it enough to read the whole thing, but I didn't love it. So I'm going to try. I really want to like Joe Abercrombie, so I'm going to try Age of Madness and see if it is better, because I've heard a lot of people say it's incredible. So I'm going to try that and see if I like that better. And if not, maybe Joe Abercrombie just isn't for me. At this point, I've read 4.5 of his books and haven't loved anything, so we'll see. I have high hopes. So that is all the books I read in January. It is a very long list. This is probably a very long video, but I had a great reading month. I had a great reading time. February is definitely going to be a little lighter, so I'm glad I was able to get to all of these in January to kind of make up for how light February will probably be, because I'm pretty busy and it's a short month. Overall, great month though. And that's the end of this video. Thank you guys for watching. If you could please like, comment, and subscribe. Let me know what your favorite book that you read in January was. If you really like my content, please hit the notification bell to be notified every time I post new videos. As always, your support means the world to me, and until next time, thank you guys.